The last guest had barely stepped out of the funeral home when I discovered that my wife's jewelry was gone. What chilled me wasn't the empty velvet case sitting inside our safe. It was the single pearl earring left behind, as if someone wanted me to know the theft had been deliberate. I'm Arthur Bennett. I'm 73 years old, and until 3 days ago, I was married to the same woman for 47 years. Margaret wasn't just my wife. She was the steady voice in every difficult season of my life. The funeral had been held on a gray Kentucky afternoon, the kind where the clouds hang low enough to make the whole world feel smaller. Friends, neighbors, former coworkers, and church members filled the chapel. They brought casseroles, flowers, and stories about Margaret's kindness. I shook hands until my fingers ached. I thanked people whose names I barely heard. Grief has a way of turning every conversation into distant noise. By the time the service ended, I felt exhausted in a way sleep could never fix. My son Daniel insisted on helping me get home. His wife Rebecca stayed close to him the entire day. Every time someone mentioned Margaret, Rebecca's face tightened for a fraction of a second before returning to a sympathetic smile. At the time, I assumed I was imagining things. Grief makes you see shadows where none exist. Back at the house, relatives moved through the rooms carrying paper plates and coffee cups. The scent of lilies mixed with the smell of fresh coffee. Margaret used to hate lilies. She always said they smelled like sadness. I found myself staring at the staircase, expecting to hear her call my name from upstairs. The silence that followed was unbearable. Around 6 o'clock, the house finally began to empty. Daniel told me to get some rest. Rebecca hugged me and said she was only a phone call away if I needed anything. They left together. The moment the front door closed, the house felt different. Not quieter, stranger, as though something important had already changed. I climbed the stairs to our bedroom. My legs felt heavier with every step. Inside the closet sat the small wall safe where Margaret kept her family jewelry collection. For generations of heirlooms. Diamond brooches, antique bracelets, pearl necklaces, and a sapphire pendant her grandmother brought from Ireland. Margaret never cared about their value. She cared about their history. She knew the story behind every piece. I entered the code automatically. After all these years, my fingers could do it without thinking. The safe opened. My heart stopped. The shelves were nearly empty. The jewelry cases were gone. The velvet trays were gone. Everything was gone except one small pearl earring resting alone in the center compartment. I stared at it for a long time. At first, I thought there had to be an explanation. Perhaps Margaret had moved the collection before her passing. Perhaps Daniel knew something. Perhaps I was simply too tired to think clearly. Then I remembered something Margaret had whispered to me 2 weeks before she died. She had squeezed my hand and smiled sadly. "Arthur," she said, "if anything happens to me, don't trust what you see first." At the time, I didn't understand what she meant. Standing there in front of that empty safe, I suddenly wondered if my wife had been trying to warn me about something. But if she knew trouble was coming, then who had she been afraid of? I stood in front of the open safe for nearly 10 minutes, staring at that single pearl earring as though it might explain everything if I looked long enough. It never did. Eventually, I closed the safe and sat down on the edge of the bed Margaret and I had shared for almost half a century. The room felt unfamiliar without her. Her reading glasses were still on the nightstand. A half-finished mystery novel rested beside them with a bookmark tucked carefully between the pages. The lamp on her side of the bed remained exactly where she had left it. Everywhere I looked, there was evidence that she had existed. Yet the one thing she treasured most was suddenly missing. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, memories returned. Margaret laughing in the kitchen while baking peach pie. Margaret humming softly while watering flowers on the porch. Margaret reaching across the center console during long drives just to squeeze my hand. Grief does strange things. It makes the past feel more real than the present. Around 3 in the morning, I got out of bed and wandered through the house. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. For the first time since her passing, I felt something besides sadness. I felt uneasy. The next morning, I made coffee the way Margaret liked it, even though she was no longer there to drink it. Habit is difficult to break after 47 years. I carried my mug into the sunroom and watched the clouds drift across the Kentucky sky. That was when I remembered another conversation we had shared a few months earlier. We had been sorting old photographs together when Margaret suddenly became quiet. She held a picture of her grandmother wearing the sapphire pendant and stared at it for several seconds. Then she looked at me and said, "Sometimes people show you who they really are when they think you are not paying attention." I had laughed and asked if she was talking about one of our neighbors. She only smiled and changed the subject. At the time, it seemed harmless. Now it felt important. By noon, relatives had started calling to check on me. I thanked them for their concern and assured everyone I was doing fine. The truth was that I could not stop thinking about the empty safe. I considered calling Daniel immediately. More than once I picked up the phone. More than once I put it back down. Accusing someone without evidence would solve nothing. Margaret always hated rash decisions. She believed patience revealed more than confrontation ever could. Late that afternoon, I walked into her dressing room. Most of her clothing remained exactly where she had left it. Her perfume sat on the vanity. Her jewelry inventory notebook rested inside the top drawer. Margaret recorded everything. Dates, descriptions, insurance information, family history. I opened the notebook expecting comfort. Instead, I found another mystery. Several pages near the back had been removed. Not torn carelessly. Removed neatly and deliberately. I turned every remaining page twice, hoping I was mistaken. I was not. Someone had taken information from the notebook before I ever opened it. I sat there holding the book in my hands as a cold realization settled over me. Whoever had emptied the safe might also have known exactly which pieces were worth taking. But how could they have known that unless Margaret had trusted them first? The following morning, I decided to stop guessing and start paying attention. Margaret had always noticed details other people ignored. If I wanted answers, I would have to do the same. I drove into town shortly after breakfast and stopped at a small diner where Daniel and Rebecca often met friends on weekends. I was not looking for evidence. I was looking for perspective. Grief can cloud judgment, and I needed to know whether I was imagining connections that did not exist. Over coffee, I found myself replaying the weeks before Margaret passed away. At the time, everything had seemed normal. Daniel visited more often than usual. Rebecca frequently offered to help organize paperwork, insurance documents, and household records. I had considered it kindness. Now I was not so sure. When I returned home that afternoon, I found Daniel's business card sitting on the kitchen counter where he must have left it after the funeral gathering. Seeing it triggered another memory. About a month before Margaret died, I had walked into the living room unexpectedly and found Daniel and Rebecca speaking quietly with her. The conversation stopped the moment I entered. Margaret smiled and changed the subject so naturally that I never questioned it. Now that moment returned with uncomfortable clarity. Later that evening, I decided to call Daniel. I kept my voice calm. I asked how he and Rebecca were doing. He sounded tired but otherwise normal. Then I casually mentioned that I had been reviewing some of Margaret's records. There was a pause. Not a long one, but long enough for me to notice. Daniel quickly asked what kind of records. The question itself was harmless. The speed of it was not. I told him I was simply organizing paperwork. His tone relaxed immediately. We spoke for another minute before ending the call. Afterward, I sat in silence, thinking about that brief hesitation. The more I considered it, the less comfortable I felt. The next day brought another surprise. Margaret's longtime housekeeper, Linda Matthews, failed to show up for her scheduled visit. That had never happened before. Linda had worked with us for nearly 12 years. She was dependable to a fault. If she was running 10 minutes late, she would call to apologize. Yet this time there was no call. No message. Nothing. By evening, I still had not heard from her. When I tried reaching her, the call went straight to voicemail. A strange feeling settled in my stomach. Linda knew the house well. She knew where Margaret kept important items. She knew the safe existed. She even knew portions of the jewelry collection because Margaret occasionally showed her family pieces while sharing stories about their history. For the first time, another possibility entered my mind. What if I had been looking in the wrong direction entirely? What if Daniel and Rebecca were innocent? What if someone else had taken advantage of the confusion surrounding Margaret's passing? The theory seemed reasonable. In fact, it seemed almost too reasonable. That night, I sat alone in the sunroom, watching darkness settle across the backyard. I wanted to believe the explanation was simple. I wanted to believe my family was not involved. Yet as I stared out the window, my eyes landed on something lying beside Margaret's favorite garden bench. It was a folded receipt, damp from the previous night's rain. When I picked it up and read the faded print, my pulse quickened. The receipt was dated 2 days before Margaret died, and it contained a reference to a private appraisal appointment. But the name listed on the document was not Margaret Bennett. It was Rebecca Bennett. I spent most of that night staring at the appraisal receipt. The paper itself was ordinary. A company logo, a date, a reference number. Yet every time I looked at Rebecca's name printed on that line, a different memory surfaced. The next morning, I called the appraisal company. I did not pretend to be clever. I simply explained that my wife had recently passed away and that I was trying to organize family records. The receptionist was polite but cautious. She could not provide details. Privacy policy, she explained. I thanked her and ended the call. Still, I had learned one important thing. The appointment had actually happened. That alone was enough to keep me awake the following night. By then, I was noticing things I had overlooked before. Small things. Margaret's comments. Rebecca's questions. Daniel's sudden interest in family heirlooms. A few months earlier, during a Sunday dinner, Rebecca had asked Margaret which pieces were the most valuable. At the time, it seemed harmless. Families talk about heirlooms all the time. Margaret had answered politely, but changed the subject almost immediately. I remembered the look they exchanged afterward. Not anger, not suspicion, something quieter, as if Margaret had filed the question away in her mind. Later that afternoon, I opened one of Margaret's photo albums. It was something I had done often since losing her. Looking at old photographs helped me feel close to her. Page after page showed birthdays, anniversaries, vacations, and family gatherings. Then I found a photograph from Thanksgiving 2 years earlier. Rebecca was standing beside Margaret in the kitchen. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then I noticed Margaret was wearing her favorite diamond bracelet, the same bracelet that had supposedly been inside the safe. I stared at the picture longer than I intended. Something about it felt important. An hour later, curiosity got the better of me. I opened Rebecca's public social media page. I had never paid much attention to social media. Margaret used to joke that I still lived in the 20th century. But now I began scrolling through photographs from charity dinners, business events, and family celebrations. Most were exactly what I expected. Smiling faces, vacation pictures, holiday decorations. Then I saw it. The image had been posted less than 3 weeks before Margaret passed away. Rebecca was attending a fundraising gala in Louisville. She stood beneath a chandelier wearing a dark blue evening dress. People surrounded her. The photograph looked completely ordinary, until I zoomed in. Around her wrist was a bracelet. A diamond bracelet. Margaret's bracelet. I felt my stomach tighten. The image quality was not perfect, yet I knew that piece better than anyone. I had given it to Margaret on our 25th wedding anniversary. The clasp had a tiny scratch near the edge where it had once caught on a garden gate. Even in the photograph, I could see it. I sat back in my chair and closed my eyes. Perhaps there was an innocent explanation. Perhaps Margaret had loaned it to Rebecca. Families did things like that. Yet another question immediately followed. If Margaret willingly shared the bracelet, why had she never mentioned it? More importantly, why had Rebecca attended a private jewelry appraisal appointment just days before Margaret died? For the first time since opening the safe, I stopped wondering whether something was wrong. The real question had become how much was wrong. The discovery of the bracelet photograph changed everything. Until then, I had been searching for explanations. Now I was searching for facts. The next morning, I drove to Louisville. The appraisal company from the receipt occupied a modest brick office tucked between a law firm and a financial planner. I did not expect anyone to reveal confidential information. I simply wanted to see the place for myself. Sometimes being present tells you more than asking questions. After introducing myself, I explained that my wife had recently passed away and that I was attempting to verify family records. The woman at the front desk remained professional, but her expression shifted slightly when I mentioned Rebecca's name. It was only a fraction of a second. Most people would have missed it. Margaret would not have. Neither did I. The receptionist politely repeated that she could not discuss clients. I thanked her and left. As I walked back to my car, I noticed a small coffee shop across the street. I decided to sit for a while and organize my thoughts. Nearly an hour later, something unexpected happened. A silver sedan pulled into the appraisal company's parking lot. Rebecca stepped out. My pulse quickened. She looked around briefly before entering the building. I checked the date on my phone. There was no reason for her to be there now. Margaret was gone. The jewelry was gone. Yet Rebecca had returned. I remained in the coffee shop for almost 2 hours. When Rebecca finally emerged, she carried a large envelope tucked beneath her arm. She drove away before I could think of following her. Even so, what I had seen raised more questions than answers. That evening I returned home exhausted. As I sorted through Margaret's remaining papers, I discovered something I had overlooked before. Hidden inside an old recipe binder was a business card. On the back, Margaret had written 3 words in her neat handwriting. Ask Olivia first. Olivia Carter. The name immediately sounded familiar. After several minutes, I remembered. Olivia was an estate attorney Margaret had consulted years earlier when updating family documents. I found her number and called the next morning. To my surprise, she answered personally. The moment I introduced myself, her voice softened. She spoke warmly about Margaret and offered condolences. Then her tone became more careful. Arthur, she said, there are a few things your wife wanted me to discuss with you eventually. I did not expect it to be this soon. My grip tightened on the phone. What kind of things? I asked. There was a brief silence. Not over the phone, Olivia replied. Some conversations are better held face to face. We arranged to meet 2 days later. After ending the call, I sat quietly in the kitchen. For the first time since opening the safe, I felt something besides confusion. Margaret had left breadcrumbs. The notebook pages. The warning. The business card. She had known something was wrong long before I did. But one question continued to haunt me. If Margaret had anticipated trouble, why had she never told me directly? And what exactly had she trusted Olivia to protect after she was gone? 2 days later, I drove to Olivia Carter's office with more questions than answers. Her building sat near the courthouse in downtown Lexington, a renovated brick structure with tall windows and polished oak floors. Margaret had always appreciated places that respected history, and somehow the office felt exactly like something she would have chosen. Olivia greeted me personally. She looked tired, as though she had been carrying a burden for quite some time. After a few moments of polite conversation, she led me into a private conference room and closed the door. On the table sat a thick folder with Margaret's name printed across the front. Seeing it made my chest tighten. Olivia folded her hands and looked directly at me. Arthur, before we begin, there is something you need to understand. Your wife was one of the most organized people I have ever worked with. That statement did not surprise me. Margaret kept records of everything. Birthdays, anniversaries, insurance policies, family recipes, even handwritten notes about furniture repairs. Olivia opened the folder and carefully removed several documents. About 8 months ago, she continued, Margaret asked me to help review her estate plans. I nodded. That alone was not unusual. Many couples our age update documents as circumstances change. Then Olivia slid a photograph across the table. The image showed several pieces from the jewelry collection arranged neatly on a velvet cloth. Every item was labeled. Every item was documented. The photograph had been taken 6 months earlier. Margaret requested a complete inventory, Olivia said. Not because she planned to sell anything. Because she was worried. My pulse quickened. Worried about what? Olivia hesitated before answering. She believed someone was becoming too interested in the collection. The room suddenly felt smaller. Did she tell you who? I asked. Olivia slowly shook her head. No, she never gave me a name. Part of me felt relieved. Another part felt frustrated. Once again, I was standing in front of a door that had only opened halfway. Olivia removed another document. This one contained appraisal values and detailed descriptions. As I reviewed the pages, something immediately caught my attention. Several pieces listed in the inventory did not match what had disappeared from the safe. At first, I assumed it was a mistake. Then I checked again. The differences were unmistakable. Certain heirlooms were missing from the inventory altogether. Olivia, I said carefully, where are the sapphire pendant and the Victorian pearl necklace? Olivia looked at me for several seconds before answering. Those pieces were removed from the collection months ago. My heart skipped a beat. Removed where? Olivia leaned back in her chair. Margaret instructed me not to disclose that information unless specific conditions were met. I stared at her in disbelief. Specific conditions? She nodded. One of those conditions was the disappearance of jewelry from the safe. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Margaret had not simply suspected trouble. She had planned for it. Every discovery seemed to reveal another layer beneath it. Then Olivia reached into the folder and placed a sealed envelope on the table. My name was written across the front in Margaret's handwriting. And suddenly I realized my wife had left me one final message. For several seconds I could not bring myself to open the envelope. I simply stared at Margaret's handwriting. After 47 years of marriage, I would have recognized those careful letters anywhere. Olivia remained silent, giving me the space to decide when I was ready. Finally, I slid a finger beneath the seal and unfolded the pages inside. The first line stopped me cold. Arthur, if you are reading this, then something happened exactly the way I feared it might. I read the sentence twice before continuing. Margaret went on to explain that over the previous year, she had begun noticing unusual questions about the jewelry collection. At first, she dismissed them. Then the questions became more specific. Who knew the safe combination? Which pieces were insured separately? Which items had the highest appraisal values? Margaret wrote that none of those questions alone concerned her. What concerned her was the pattern. She had spent her entire life studying people. Patterns mattered to her. According to the letter, she quietly began documenting everything. Conversations, dates, requests, comments that seemed insignificant at the time. She never accused anyone. She never confronted anyone. Instead, she observed. That sounded exactly like Margaret. The next page revealed something even more surprising. 6 months earlier, she had instructed Olivia to help relocate several heirlooms to a secure location. Not because she planned to sell them. Not because she distrusted everyone. Because she wanted to know who could be trusted if temptation appeared. I lowered the letter and looked at Olivia. She said a test. Olivia nodded slowly. In a manner of speaking. My eyes returned to the page. Margaret explained that certain pieces remaining in the safe were intentionally left there. They were genuine valuables, but not the most important items in the collection. She believed that if someone attempted to take them after her passing, the act itself would reveal far more than the loss of property ever could. My chest tightened as I continued reading. Then I reached the final paragraph. Arthur, there is one person I need you to watch carefully. Not because I know they are guilty, because I am no longer certain they are innocent. There was no name, no clue, no indication of who she meant. Only that single sentence. I felt frustration rising inside me. Even now, Margaret was forcing me to think instead of handing me answers. Olivia handed me a glass of water. There is something else, she said quietly. She opened the folder again and removed a copy of a financial authorization form. I immediately recognized Daniel's signature near the bottom. My stomach dropped. The document authorized access to information related to the jewelry inventory. The date was 4 months before Margaret died. I stared at the signature. Daniel had never mentioned this. Not once. Olivia leaned forward. Arthur, before you jump to conclusions, understand that signatures do not always tell the whole story. I appreciated the warning. I truly did. But as I looked at my son's name on that page, another memory surfaced. Daniel's hesitation on the phone. Rebecca's visit to the appraisal office. The missing notebook pages. The bracelet in the photograph. Individually, each detail could be explained away. Together, they were becoming harder to ignore. Then Olivia reached into the folder one final time and placed a printed photograph on the table. The image showed a private auction preview held only 3 weeks earlier. Several display cases lined the room. Wealthy collectors mingled beneath crystal chandeliers. My eyes moved across the photograph until they landed on a familiar face standing near one of the jewelry exhibits. It was Daniel. For a long moment, I could not take my eyes off the photograph. Daniel stood near one of the display cases with his hands in his pockets, speaking to a man in an expensive suit. He did not look uncomfortable. He did not look surprised to be there. He looked familiar with the setting, as though he belonged in that room. Olivia allowed me time to absorb what I was seeing. Where did this photograph come from? I finally asked. A private auction consultant provided it after Margaret's instructions were activated, Olivia replied. Your wife arranged for certain information to be released if specific events occurred. Once again, I found myself amazed by how far ahead Margaret had planned. Even now, she seemed to be guiding the investigation one step at a time. I studied the image more closely. The display case beside Daniel was partially visible. Most of the contents were obscured by reflections from the overhead lights. But one item caught my attention immediately. A pearl necklace. Not just any necklace. Margaret's Victorian pearl necklace. The same one Olivia had told me had been removed from the original collection months earlier. My heart began to race. That cannot be possible, I said quietly. Olivia leaned forward. Why not? I pointed toward the display case. Because according to Margaret's records, that necklace was relocated to a secure location. Olivia examined the photograph and frowned. then either we are looking at a different necklace, or someone wanted buyers to believe it was the original. The distinction mattered a great deal. If the necklace was genuine, then someone had accessed property Margaret deliberately protected. If it was not genuine, then someone was creating the illusion that the heirlooms were available for sale. Neither possibility made me comfortable. After leaving Olivia's office, I drove home through steady afternoon rain. My thoughts kept returning to Daniel. I wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation. Parents spend a lifetime believing they know their children. Even when evidence begins to suggest otherwise, the heart resists. That evening Daniel called unexpectedly. He asked how I was doing. His voice sounded normal, almost cheerful. We spoke for several minutes about ordinary things. The weather, the house, funeral thank you cards I still needed to send. Then he casually mentioned that Rebecca would be attending a charity event later that week. The comment seemed insignificant until I remembered where I had first seen Margaret's bracelet. Another charity event. Another photograph. Another coincidence. When the call ended, I sat alone in the kitchen staring at the dark window above the sink. Margaret used to say that coincidences become patterns when they happen often enough. By now the patterns were impossible to ignore. Just before midnight, an email arrived from Olivia. Attached was a document Margaret had prepared 3 months before her death. The title was simple: Individuals Requiring Further Observation. My pulse quickened as I opened the file. I expected to see one name, perhaps two. Instead, there were 3. Rebecca Bennett, Daniel Bennett, and to my complete shock, Linda Matthews, our longtime housekeeper. Suddenly the mystery was no longer pointing in a single direction. It was becoming something much larger, and I no longer knew which of the 3 had betrayed Margaret first. The next morning, I printed Margaret's observation list and placed it on the kitchen table. 3 names: Rebecca, Daniel, Linda. I stared at them while my coffee grew cold. If Margaret had included Linda, she had a reason. My wife never acted on instinct alone. She gathered information first. That afternoon, I finally reached Linda by telephone. Her voice sounded strained, almost nervous. She immediately apologized for disappearing. According to her, she had left town unexpectedly to care for an elderly cousin in Tennessee. The explanation seemed reasonable, yet something felt different. During 12 years of working with us, Linda had never vanished without notice. Not once. I asked when she planned to return. She hesitated before saying she was unsure. After we ended the call, I sat quietly for several minutes replaying every word. The conversation had answered nothing. If anything, it had created more questions. Later that evening, I opened another folder Olivia had sent me. Inside were copies of notes Margaret had written during the previous year. Most were brief observations, dates, locations, small details that seemed insignificant on their own. Then I found an entry that made me stop reading. 6 months earlier, Margaret had written, Daniel asked whether jewelry values increase after the owner passes away. Strange question. I read the sentence 3 times. The note continued. Rebecca answered before I could respond. She seemed unusually interested. My stomach tightened. I wanted to dismiss it. People ask odd questions all the time. Yet combined with everything else, the note felt impossible to ignore. The following day, another message arrived from Olivia. Attached was a schedule from the private auction house. Several jewelry preview events had taken place during the previous 3 months. One event included a guest list. As I scanned the names, I found Daniel again. This time there was no blurry photograph, no uncertain identification. His name appeared clearly in the registration records. According to the document, he had attended with a guest. The guest's name was Rebecca Bennett. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. Until that moment, I had been searching for innocent explanations. They were becoming increasingly difficult to find. Still, one detail continued to bother me. If Daniel and Rebecca had truly planned something, why would Margaret place Linda's name beside theirs? The answer arrived unexpectedly that evening. While organizing old household records, I discovered a maintenance invoice from nearly a year earlier. The invoice included a note regarding the bedroom safe. Someone had requested access after forgetting part of the combination sequence. The request had been logged during a weekday afternoon. On that date, I had been visiting my brother in Ohio. Daniel had been working out of state. Rebecca had attended a conference in Louisville. Only 2 people had been in the house with Margaret. Margaret herself and Linda. Suddenly, a possibility I had resisted from the beginning became impossible to ignore. Perhaps this was never a single betrayal. Perhaps more than one person had been involved from the very start. And if that was true, then Margaret's test had not exposed one dishonest person. It had exposed an entire chain of trust that had quietly broken apart around her. The deeper I looked, the more I began to understand what Margaret had been doing during her final year. She had not been preparing for death. She had been preparing for the possibility that someone close to her would mistake her kindness for weakness. 3 days after discovering the maintenance invoice, Olivia called and asked me to come to her office again. This time her tone sounded different, more certain. When I arrived, she was waiting with a small digital recorder and a sealed packet of documents. She explained that Margaret had created a sequence of instructions, calm, thoughtful, completely in control. In the recording, she explained that several months earlier she had arranged a private meeting with a security consultant. She had become concerned after noticing repeated attempts to gather information about the jewelry collection. Rather than confront anyone, she decided to document everything. She recorded dates, conversations, and unusual requests. Then she said something that changed the entire investigation. If you are listening to this, Arthur, then the jewelry taken from the safe was never the real target. I looked at Olivia in confusion. She simply nodded and encouraged me to keep listening. Margaret explained that the collection remaining inside the safe had been intentionally reorganized. The pieces with the deepest family significance had already been moved elsewhere. What remained were valuable items, but not the treasures she truly wanted protected. More importantly, she believed whoever attempted to take them would reveal their motives in the process. The recording ended with one final statement. Pay attention to who becomes impatient. Impatience reveals more than greed. Afterward, Olivia handed me the packet of documents. Inside were visitor logs, copies of emails, and appointment records connected to the appraisal company. Several names appeared repeatedly. Rebecca's name appeared most often. Daniel's appeared fewer times, but often immediately after Rebecca's. Linda's name appeared only twice. That detail surprised me. The evidence that once seemed to point equally toward all three people no longer felt balanced. As I reviewed the records, another pattern emerged. Nearly every significant event occurred after Rebecca entered the picture. The appraisal appointments, the inventory questions, the auction inquiries, the requests for valuation reports. Daniel's involvement appeared connected, but Rebecca seemed to be the one creating momentum. For the first time, I began to suspect that Margaret's observation list had never been intended to identify three equally guilty people. It had been designed to show relationships, connections, influence. As I prepared to leave, Olivia handed me one final document. It was an attendance confirmation for a private trust meeting scheduled the following week. Rebecca and Daniel had both already confirmed their participation. They clearly believed something important awaited them. Olivia looked at me carefully before speaking. Arthur, I think your wife knew exactly what they were expecting. I glanced down at the document and noticed a handwritten note Margaret had added months earlier. 6 simple words. The truth arrives before the inheritance. Suddenly, I realized the final stage of Margaret's plan was about to begin. The trust meeting was held the following Thursday in a conference room overlooking downtown Lexington. The morning sky was clear, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something close to calm. Not because I knew every answer, because I finally trusted that Margaret had left them somewhere ahead of me. Daniel and Rebecca arrived together. Rebecca carried herself with the same confidence I had seen in so many photographs. Daniel looked more tired than usual, but he still managed a polite greeting. Neither of them seemed concerned. In fact, they appeared almost optimistic. Olivia welcomed everyone and began distributing folders. I noticed Rebecca glance toward the documents with barely concealed anticipation. It was a small expression, gone almost instantly, but it reminded me of something Margaret once said. People reveal themselves most clearly when they believe a reward is within reach. The meeting began with routine legal matters. Estate summaries, property records, administrative details. Rebecca remained attentive throughout. Daniel occasionally asked questions about timelines and distributions. Nothing sounded unusual until Olivia reached the final section. The room became noticeably quieter. She opened a separate folder and removed a document bearing Margaret's signature. Then she began reading. Margaret's statement explained that family wealth was never meant to be measured by jewelry, property, or bank accounts. It was measured by trust. She wrote that trust could not be inherited. It had to be earned. Rebecca shifted slightly in her chair. Daniel looked down at the table. Olivia continued reading. Margaret described the safeguards she had created during the previous year. Inventory records, independent reviews, observation logs, secure transfers. Everything had been documented. Every significant action had been anticipated. Then came the sentence that changed the atmosphere in the room. Any beneficiary found participating in the unauthorized removal, valuation, transfer, or attempted sale of family assets shall forfeit all inheritance rights under this trust. Silence followed. Complete silence. Rebecca's expression froze. Daniel blinked several times as though trying to process what he had heard. Olivia calmly placed several documents on the table. Appraisal appointments, auction registrations, financial authorizations, communication records. None of them required raised voices. None of them required accusations. The paper trail spoke for itself. Rebecca finally broke the silence. She insisted there had been a misunderstanding. Daniel claimed he believed he was helping organize family assets. Olivia listened without interruption. When they finished, she slid one final document across the table. It was Margaret's personal declaration, signed months earlier and witnessed legally. In it, she explained exactly why the conditions existed. She had not wanted punishment. She wanted clarity. She wanted actions to reveal character. According to the trust provisions, Daniel and Rebecca were disqualified from receiving any distribution connected to the protected assets. Instead, Margaret had directed those resources elsewhere. As the reality settled over the room, I found myself looking not at the documents, but at the empty chairs beside us. The places where Margaret's presence should have been. She was gone, yet somehow she had still managed to tell the truth more clearly than anyone else in that room. And then Olivia revealed where the inheritance had actually gone. Olivia waited until the room became completely still before continuing. Rebecca's confidence had vanished. Daniel looked pale and exhausted. Neither of them interrupted as Olivia opened the final section of Margaret's trust documents. She explained that the assets they believed would be distributed among family members had already been reassigned months earlier. Margaret had established a charitable education trust supporting nursing students throughout Kentucky. The majority of her financial estate had been directed there. The protected heirlooms followed a separate set of instructions entirely. Rebecca stared at the documents as though they had been written in another language. Daniel looked at me, searching for some sign that I would challenge what was happening. I said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Margaret had made her decisions long before any of us entered that room. Olivia then produced a small wooden box. I recognized it immediately. Margaret had owned it for years. She kept personal letters inside, along with photographs that mattered only to her. Olivia opened the lid and removed a folded document. "This is Margaret's final personal statement," she said. Her voice softened noticeably. The statement was not legal language. It was simply Margaret speaking in her own words. She wrote that every family eventually faces a moment when values become more important than valuables. She explained that the purpose of the trust had never been to reward obedience or punish mistakes. It was designed to reveal character. According to Margaret, inheritance should be based not on blood alone, but on integrity. Then came the final surprise. Olivia removed a key attached to a small tag. Written on the tag was an address I did not recognize. Margaret's statement explained that the most meaningful pieces of the family collection had never been stored in the house during her final months. They had been secured elsewhere, not because she feared losing them, because she wanted them protected until the right time. The room remained silent as Olivia handed me the key. Rebecca finally spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper. She asked where the jewelry was. Olivia calmly informed her that the information would remain confidential. The trust documents authorized access for only one person, me. For the first time since Margaret passed away, I felt something shift inside me. The confusion that had dominated every day since the funeral began to lift. Not because every question had been answered, because Margaret had already answered the most important one. She knew exactly who she was. She knew exactly what mattered to her. And she refused to let anyone redefine either after she was gone. As the meeting ended, Daniel remained seated for several moments. He looked older than I had ever seen him. Rebecca avoided eye contact entirely. They left together without another word. I watched the door close behind them. Then I looked down at the key resting in my hand. A simple brass key. Nothing extraordinary about it. Yet somehow it felt heavier than any object I had held in weeks. Olivia gathered the remaining papers and offered a small, knowing smile. "There is one final instruction," she said. "Margaret wanted you to visit that address alone." I slipped the key into my pocket and glanced once more at the handwritten note attached to it. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, I was no longer searching for the truth. I was on my way to meet it.